We're really excited to share this project with you. This is Channel House. It's a project in Silvan that came to us 18 months in. The previous designer had already been engaged, and unfortunately their fees had grown well beyond what was originally quoted. And at the end of it, they had no town planning permit. They had a design with serious problems, a brief that had never really been answered, and a family who were exhausted by the whole thing. We then took the project over and we went through every page of what it already existed, identified what wasn't working and why, redesigned it from the ground up and had a town planning permit in just 4 months. The building permit is just about to be released and construction will start very soon. This series is a story of that project, what we found when we opened those drawings, what we changed and why, and where Channel House is right now. And it's becoming the home Ryan and Melissa asked for from the very beginning. And that's what the next 3 episodes are about. It's introducing this project from where it came from and where it is now, and then we will document it moving it forward. Picture standing on a block of land you bought to build your family's future on. 18 months later, you had nothing to show for it. And it wasn't because you didn't know what you wanted. It's because the project kept running into issues, such as revisions, additional work, additional fees, and it never quite got over the line. That's not a hypothetical. That's exactly where Ryan and Melissa were, on their block in Silvan, 18 months into a project that was supposed to take about 18 months. And that included months of additional fees and still not owning an approved single drawing to show for it. Here's what happened across those 18 months and why it matters if you're anywhere near a project like this one. This is Channel House. To be exact, it's 5,435 square meters in Silvan. It's semi-rural and it was bought by Ryan and Melissa for their 2 boys to grow up in. But this was never meant to be just a simple, quiet family home and nothing else. When Ryan and Melissa described to me what they wanted, the list was specific. 4 bedrooms, a master suite with views across to the strawberry farm on the neighbouring property, a triple garage, a large shed that was big enough for caravans, dirt bikes, and the kind of equipment that accumulates when you live on a site like this. A pool and a spa, a sauna, an entertaining deck, a cabana, a media room, a large entertaining lounge with a bar, a walk-in with a pantry accessible from both the kitchen and the outdoor entertaining area, a change room off the pool so people don't have to take their wet clothes through the interior, powder rooms, a large mud room and laundry that could handle a family coming from this rural property outside to inside. When looking at that brief, that's not just a house. That's a full property, and it's a place that is designed around life. It's camping trips, it's dirt bikes, it's coming back home, and when you're home, you want to host people properly. You want to be able to cook for everyone properly and have the space to do it. The block isn't where you go to rest between adventures. It's where everything comes back to, where the Saturday mornings happen, where the birthdays happen, where the memories that a family actually carry forward get made. And it's in a kitchen that connects to a living room that opens onto a deck that's big enough to actually use. So when this property came up with the right slope, the right view, and the right amount of room, it wasn't an opportunity to put a house just anywhere. It was the site where an entire way of living could finally have the space it needed. Every item on that brief existed for a reason, and each one needed an architect who understood that reason before a single line was drawn. The block itself sits on a gentle slope, semi-rural, with enough separation between the house, the shed, the pool, and the entertaining areas that each zone could properly be resolved without compromising another. That's not available on a standard suburban block. It's exactly what 5,000 meters makes possible. It means there was no excuses for getting it wrong. The constraints that force shortcuts elsewhere did not exist here. When they bought this land, what they needed wasn't complicated to describe. It was a home that matched the brief that we just discussed, and it was designed to work spatially, built to perform through a Melbourne year, documented well enough that a builder could price it and construct it without any surprises. And of course, it needed to get through town planning. If you don't have town planning, we're not even worried about the build. The permit was only one milestone on that path. The finished home was the end game. It's not a documentation job, and it's not a process of producing drawings that meet minimum requirements. This was a genuine, considered response to a specific and detailed brief, with all the thinking that the brief actually required. 18 months later, what had been produced was something much narrower than what had been asked for. The planning process had stalled, the fees had grown, and the home that Ryan and Melissa had described on day one, the thing they wanted to live in, was nowhere in the drawings. What happened across that period is the story this episode is about, and it's important to understand that this could have been avoided. What followed wasn't one bad meeting with the client or the designer. It was 18 months of the same pattern repeating itself on a loop neither of them could see a way out of. For context, a straightforward town planning application for a project like this on a block without unusual complications. Looking at a rural site like Silvan, you have the standard things where you've got the erosion, you have the bushfire, things we've discussed in other episodes. This might reasonably take 3 to 6 months from the first submission to the town permit when looking at council submissions, but it also depends on council workload and what gets referred out to other authorities. However, I can say 18 months without a permit isn't just slow. It's a sign that something was going wrong consistently. So speaking to Ryan and Melissa, here's what this period looked like from the inside. And this is what happened when there is a lack of communication. Council would come back with a question, or flag something missing, or ask for a correction. The previous designer would address it eventually, and an invoice would follow for that extra work. Then another issue would surface a few months later, then another invoice. Month after month, the answer to how close are we actually to a town planning permit was always some version of, we're nearly there. And here's the part that matters more than the fee growing on its own. Many of these invoices weren't for the new work that Ryan and Melissa had asked for. They were for variations. They were for additional scope items that kept appearing. It's things that should have already been there. Being invoiced for work you didn't ask for and thought you'd already paid for was a specific kind of frustrating. It's no longer, this has got more expensive because we've added room. It's, we're paying again for something that we already thought was covered, and we still don't have what we need. What started as a single quote fee, quoted for the whole project, nearly doubled before it was over. And at the end of all of it, there was still no planning permit on the table. A town planning permit, to be clear about what that means, is the council approval that has come through before anything else can happen. Before a building permit, before construction starts, before a single footing is poured. No permit means the project sits regardless of how many drawings exist. It's the first step in the design journey. And it's important that when we design at the very beginning, we factor in what the council wants to see so we don't run into these kinds of scenarios. And here's the detail that only became clear when we went through the drawings properly. Even if the town planning permit had eventually come through, even if all that waiting had finally produced that one approval that they were waiting for, Ryan and Melissa would have immediately hit a second wall. The design had accessibility issues. A building permit, which is the separate approval from the town planning permit and the one that actually allows construction to actually start. It would not have been granted on this design as it was drawn. The home didn't meet the NCC 2022 livable housing design standards. And the NCC, which stands for the National Construction Code, sets the minimum requirements for every building in Australia. The livable housing standards that came into effect in May 2024 are accessibility requirements specifically. And these include step-free entries, wider hallways, wider doors, an accessible toilet on the entry level. They apply to every new home in Victoria. Unfortunately, they are not optional and they can't be worked around after the fact. To get a building permit, they would have needed to go back to council with an amendment, which means the whole planning process would have started again. It hadn't resolved the issues the project needed to resolve, including ones it hadn't even reached yet. A variation in the case the term is unfamiliar is additional work outside the agreed scope, and it's billed separately. In a healthy project, variations happen when a client changes their mind or asks for more than what was first agreed. It's a normal part of almost any builds. Sometimes you don't know what you fully want at the start, and it's not till halfway through you're like, let's add this, let's add that. And that's not a problem, that's normal. The issue is what's harder to navigate is when variations keep appearing and the reason isn't clear. Through all of this, life didn't pause. Ryan kept running his roofing business. Melissa kept running her business and raising 2 young boys. The project that was meant to give their family more space and more freedom became instead one more thing competing for attention and patience that neither of them had much spare of. There's a point in a process like this where you stop asking, what does our home look like? And start asking, will this ever actually happen? That's what a prolonged, stalled process does to people who started out excited about something. For Ryan and Melissa, that point had arrived. What it looked like when we understood why, that's what this section is about. By month 18, it was a project that had quietly drifted away from what they bought the land for in the first place. The floor plans didn't match what they wanted, and this was the awakening point where they said, we need to do something. Because that home is supposed to be about freedom and entertaining, and it had become a source of dread every time an invoice or a correspondence about it landed in their inbox. The picture of camping gear and motorbikes finally having a proper place to live, of friends actually wanting to come and stay for a weekend, had been replaced by a much smaller but much more exhausting question. When is this actually going to be finished? And what's it going to cost to get us there this time? And underneath all of that, this is the part that only became clear when we opened the drawings. When we reviewed the documentation, it became clear the design that existed didn't reflect the brief Ryan and Melissa had given. What had been produced had become increasingly focused on the planning process, while key parts of the original brief remained unresolved. It wouldn't satisfy the brief they'd described. Those are two different questions to be answering. What does this family actually need, and how do we design a home that delivers it? Versus, what's the minimum required on paper to satisfy council? The first approach produces a home that works for the people living in it. The drawings we opened were unfortunately closer to the second. Channel House had been treated like just a house. And for a brief that was never just a house, meant to be a showcase home, an entertaining home, a home built around a life that was already being lived. That gap between the brief and what was produced was always going to surface somewhere. In this case, it surfaced everywhere at once after all that time. Unfortunately, there's an irony sitting underneath all of this worth naming, even before the next episode gets into the technical detail. Ryan spends his working week on other people's roofs, resolving problems for clients who trust him to get it right. Watching his own family's home sit in limbo for 18 months while he made a living doing exactly the opposite for everyone else, that's not a small thing to carry around quietly for a year and a half. He had every right to be frustrated. And they didn't know exactly what was wrong with the drawings themselves. The floor plan, the roof, the rooms that didn't work, that part comes in the next episode and we will break that down. What they knew by month 18, however, with total certainty, was how the whole thing felt. They were completely deflated, and they were frustrated with how the process had gone, and no closer to a permit than they had been over a year earlier. There's usually a specific point in a situation like this, and it's not a single dramatic blow-up, but a quiet moment where you stop believing the next update will be any different from the last 9. For Ryan and Melissa, that point had clearly arrived. That pattern actually cost them, not in fees, but in the things that fees were supposed to buy. 10 months doesn't just cost time on a calendar. It costs the family their patience, their trust in the process, and in this case, their belief that their home that they'd originally pictured was even still possible. Every month that this dragged on was a month the boys got older without a finished home to grow up into. A month closer to the possibility that council requirements or site conditions could shift enough that the parts of the application might need resubmitting from scratch. A month where we are building a built home around freedom started to feel exactly like the opposite. A project they felt trapped inside, with no clear end date and no one giving them a straight up answer about when there would be one. There's a quieter cost too, easy to miss if you're not the one living through it. Over a year of being told nearly there erodes a person's ability to trust the next professional who tells them anything about their project. That's not a small thing to lose. By the time Ryan and Melissa were ready to look elsewhere, they weren't just looking for a better design. They were looking for someone who would actually tell them the truth, even when the truth wasn't what they wanted to hear. And they had every reason by that point to be skeptical that they'd actually find it out there. One thing that this project reinforced for us is how much the scope of thinking matters before a single line is drawn. A home like Channel House, the brief, the site, the ambition behind it, isn't a documentation problem. It's a design problem. What Ryan and Melissa needed was someone who would work through every single implication of every decision before anything was committed to paper. Not just what would get through council, what would perform through a Melbourne winter and then a 40-degree February. What would actually work for a family who wants to entertain properly. What a builder could price and construct without weekly phone calls asking what was meant by a particular detail. That kind of thinking doesn't happen by accident. It's either built into the engagement from the start or it isn't. And when it isn't, the gaps show up. It shows up in the planning process, in the drawings, in the rooms that don't do what the brief asks them to do. A well-run project isn't one where nothing goes wrong. It's one where questions that are going to arise have already been addressed and thought through before they arrive as surprises. What Ryan and Melissa had lived through was a process where several critical issues, compliance, brief alignment, the planning pathway itself, were still unresolved after 18 months. Whether they'd been missed or identified and not yet addressed isn't something we can know from the outside. What we could see when we opened the file was that they were still there, which is why the first conversation we had with them wasn't about design. It was about something more basic than that. So they made the only decision that made sense at that point. They decided we're no longer waiting for nearly there. And we're not waiting for that nearly there to become done. And they went looking for someone who would tell them plainly whether what they had was even salvageable. And that's not an easy decision to make over a year and a great deal of money into a project. There's a real pull to keep with whoever you started with, just to avoid losing what had already been spent. Walking away from that takes a particular kind of bravery, and the recognition that more of the same process was only ever going to produce more of the same result. And that's how Channel House landed on our desk. Not as a clean start the way most projects do, as a project that had already cost a family 18 months and nearly double what they had budgeted for documentation alone, with nothing built and nothing approved to show for it. When we take on a project, the brief is where we start, not the drawings. Before a single line is committed to on paper, we need to understand what the family actually needs in detail and why each item on the list exists. That brief then becomes the reference point for every single decision that follows. If a design decision cannot be justified against the brief, it doesn't need to be there and it doesn't stay in the design. That process does cost time at the start, but by the time that drawings exist, they've already been through against the planning scheme, the compliance requirements, and the question of whether a builder can actually price and construct what's been drawn. Problems that show up as surprises later get resolved as decisions earlier. Not because surprises can always be avoided, but because most of them can be seen coming if you're actually looking. We didn't promise Ryan and Melissa any of that in the first conversation. We told them the only honest thing that we could tell them. That we wouldn't know what was actually wrong or whether any of it could be fixed until we'd gone through every single page of what had already existed properly ourselves. And that first conversation wasn't really about design at all. It was about establishing whether there was still a way forward and being upfront that we couldn't answer that yet. We asked for everything, every drawing, every council letter, every consultant report, every communication that had to do with this project. Not because we doubted what we'd been told, but because the only safe starting point was the actual paper trail, not anyone's memory of it. What that paper trail revealed and what it gave Ryan and Melissa for the first time in a very long time is where this episode lands. This stage produced wasn't a design. It wasn't even a clear sense yet of what was wrong with one. It was a decision to stop accepting nearly there as an answer after all that time of hearing it. For Ryan and Melissa, that decision mattered more than it might sound from the outside. It meant that choosing to spend more time and more effort after already losing a year and a half on the chance that someone could deliver what they wanted from the very beginning. It meant trusting again, after a year and a half of reasons not to. That's not a small ask of anyone, and it's not one at Akasni Architects that we take lightly. That's where we picked this project up. 18 months in, no permit, a fee nearly double what was first quoted, and a family who somehow still hadn't given up the home that they'd pictured the day they bought this block. It also meant, in a smaller but real way, simply being heard, being asked what they wanted from the project in the first place, rather than only what needed fixing on a drawing that didn't reflect what they wanted. That's not nothing, after all the time of feeling like a problem to be managed rather than a family with a brief. It also set terms for everything that follows in this story. Whatever we found once we opened the drawing set, however bad or however fixable, Ryan and Melissa had already decided they wanted the truth over more reassurance. That's a higher bar than most clients arrive or expect with, and it's exactly the bar the next episode had to meet. Our role isn't to tell clients what they want to hear. Our role is to give honest advice, even when those conversations are difficult. Our job is to give you the dream home that you asked for. Our next episode, we go through exactly what we found when we opened up that drawing set, room by room, walking it the way Ryan and Melissa would have walked it themselves. What was actually wrong and why it had taken 18 months to get nowhere, and what it would take to fix it properly. Because understanding why a project fails matters, but seeing exactly where it failed in detail is what makes the fix possible. Once you've waited this long, you don't want another opinion. You want evidence. And the evidence when we went through those drawings was significant. Every room, every junction, everything the brief asked for that the design had not answered yet. Go back to the image from the start, standing on the block of land you bought your family's future. 18 months later, you had nothing. For Ryan and Melissa, that land was supposed to be the place everything came back to. The table outside full of people on a Saturday night, birthday mornings in a kitchen that connected to the life around it, the shed that meant the bikes and the caravan had a home, so weekends away could always happen without turning the garage into an obstacle course. A master bedroom where you could look across the block and see the strawberry farm on the hill. A home that was big enough and organised enough and thought through enough that a family living in it had room to live. 18 months in, none of that existed yet. Not because the land couldn't hold it, but because nobody had given it a design that could. That's the cost of a process that goes wrong before any of the technical details comes into it. Not a single ruined drawing, but a family standing on a land full of potential with their actual life still on hold. When we look at the brief, they hadn't asked for much. When you break it down, they just wanted a home that answered the brief they'd given. They wanted a process that moved, and they wanted honesty when something needed to change. 18 months later, they still didn't have any of these. And that's where we came in, and that's where this story begins.